How much do you think you know about American politics? Today we're going to be doing something a little different for this channel, an iceberg. And since we're trying something new, I brought help. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Adam.
Thank you, Cole. I'm Adam, a European with the goal of educating people, but also myself, on various important topics on YouTube. So check out the Payoff channel if you want to see me rant or watch similar iceberg videos on said topics.
I'll be doing the odd layers and Adam will be doing the even ones. So without further ado, grab a snack or a drink, plant yourself on the couch, and let's get into it. Starting off with layer 1, we have Party Switch, Freedom Fries, Brown v. Board of Education, Watergate, Monica Lewinsky, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Trump-Russia Connection, CIA waterboarding, and Benghazi. Hell of a first layer, let's get into it. Party Switch. Believe it or not, Republicans were once widely associated with civil rights and federal power, while Democrats were more closely tied to states' rights, small government, and conservatism. Between the late 19th and mid-20th century, these identities slowly unraveled and reassembled into the political landscape we recognize today. Let's look at the American electoral map from 1916, the race between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes. The divide looks almost unrecognizable. Most southern states voted Democrat, while states like New York, Oregon, and the North voted Republican. This pattern holds for decades. The solid South remains reliably Democratic, not because of progressive values, but because the Democratic Party in the South was deeply invested in segregation and local control. That equilibrium begins to crack in the mid-20th century. In 1964, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law, a move that permanently reshapes American politics. Southern Democrats feel betrayed. Johnson himself reportedly acknowledged the consequences, allegedly saying the Democrats had lost the South for a generation. What followed is a long, gradual political realignment. White conservative voters in the South gradually migrate toward the Republican Party, while black and progressive voters consolidate under the Democrats. By the late 90s, the parties had effectively switched places. The names stayed the same, but the values, the voters, and the map completely inverted. Freedom Fries. In 2003, President George W. Bush launched the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a move widely criticized for lacking the United Nations authorization and violating the UN Charter. France publicly opposed the invasion, arguing the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction was unreliable. In response, a wave of anti-French sentiment spread across American media and conservative political circles. The trend reportedly began with a small restaurant called Cubby's in North Carolina, which renamed French fries to Freedom Fries as protest. The idea quickly went national. Cafeterias, diners, and sports venues followed suit, and in a particularly symbolic move, the U.S. House of Representatives officially renamed French fries and French toast in congressional cafeterias to Freedom Fries and Freedom Toast. In 2006, when everyone realized the war was a disaster, the House quietly switched back to French fries and pretended the whole embarrassing episode had never happened. Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling that would fundamentally reshape the country, declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. With that sentence, the court overturned its own 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which had legalized racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. Brown v. Board of Education didn't end racism, and it didn't instantly integrate American schools, but it did destroy the legal foundation that segregation rested on. It turned Jim Crow from settled law into a constitutional problem and gave the civil rights movement a weapon it had never had before: the courts. Watergate. This one's a doozy, guys. In 1972, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C., and were caught with wiretapping equipment. After 2 years of investigative journalism and litigation, it was found that the Committee for Re-election of the President, CRP, was behind it. Now, President Dick Nixon didn't directly order the break-in, but he did orchestrate the massive cover-up, paying hush money and telling the FBI to stop investigating. He won the 1972 election in a landslide, but the tapes came out and he was forced to resign on August 9th, 1974. If you want to know more about this one, there are so many Watergate documentaries, books, movies, you name it. You can find it out there. Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky was hired as an intern for the office of the Chief of Staff in the summer of 1995 during Bill Clinton's presidency. Sometime that November, Bill Clinton took a liking to 22-year-old Miss Lewinsky, and they began a 2-year-long affair. 1 year prior to that, in 1994, a woman named Paula Jones filed a suit against Clinton for sexual harassment that occurred while he was the governor of Arkansas. Monica Lewinsky was called by Jones's lawyers as a witness, for which she signed an affidavit saying that she had never had a physical relationship with Bill Clinton. This led to the all-too-famous clip of Bill Clinton lying to the world with the statement,
"I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never."
Spoiler, he did. Linda Tripp, a close friend and co-worker of Lewinsky's at the time, had recorded several phone conversations in which Lewinsky talked in detail about her relationship with Bill Clinton. These conversations were made public through Clinton v. Jones and led to the impeachment of Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. While Clinton retained his public reputation, Lewinsky became the primary public casualty of the scandal and was subjected to years of ridicule, harassment, and media abuse. Since then, Lewinsky has managed to rebuild her life as an activist, focusing on the exact kind of massive public shaming that nearly destroyed her: weapons of mass destruction. When most people think of weapons of mass destruction, they picture nuclear bombs, but that isn't the full definition. According to the Department of Homeland Security, a WMD is a nuclear, radiological, chemical, biological, or other device that is intended to harm a large number of people. The central justification for the 2003 invasion of Iraq was the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons and an active nuclear program. The Bush administration presented this as an urgent threat. In February of 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations, holding a vial meant to represent anthrax and laying out intelligence that was framed as conclusive. The case was treated as settled, but it wasn't. After the invasion, the fall of the Iraqi government, and years of occupation, no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Key pieces of evidence unraveled. The yellow cake uranium documents were exposed as forgeries. The aluminum tubes cited as proof of a nuclear program were intended for conventional rockets. This meant that intelligence had been exaggerated, selectively used, or simply wrong. The war went forward anyway, though. We were sold a threat that didn't exist. The weapons weren't there, the war happened anyway, and we're still dealing with the fallout of that today. The Trump-Russia connection. Donald Trump has deep, documented ties to Russia. Not allegedly, not in Minecraft. This comes directly from official US government reports. In 2019, Special Counsel Robert Mueller released the Mueller Report. In 2020, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee released its own findings. While neither report found a signed agreement proving a criminal conspiracy, both confirmed that the Trump campaign welcomed, encouraged, and benefited from Russian assistance. Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, shared internal polling data with a known Russian intelligence asset. Donald Trump Jr. took a meeting inside Trump Tower specifically to receive dirt on Hillary Clinton from representatives of the Russian government. At the same time, Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer at the time, was negotiating a deal to build Trump Tower Moscow during the election, while Trump publicly claimed that he had no business interests in Russia. None of this is speculation. It's documented through emails, testimony, and intelligence reports. The debate at this point isn't about whether the connections were real. We know they were. The real question is whether we actually ever got the full story. I'm willing to bet we didn't. CIA waterboarding. Following 9/11, the CIA authorized so-called enhanced interrogation techniques at black sites around the world. The most infamous was waterboarding, a method that simulates drowning. Allow me to demonstrate, but don't try this at home. The Bush administration insisted it wasn't torture, relying on secret memos that redefined the word torture so narrowly that it was almost a joke. The rest of the world disagreed. So did the Senate. The 2014 Senate Torture Report concluded that the practice was brutal, ineffective, and repeatedly lied about by the CIA. Detainees like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, former head of propaganda for al-Qaeda, were waterboarded dozens, in some cases hundreds of times. No meaningful intelligence was gained, no senior officials were held accountable, all of it was documented, and nothing ever came of it. Benghazi. On September 11, 2012, Islamic militants attacked 2 U.S. government facilities in Benghazi, Libya. 4 Americans were killed, including Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens. The attack took place in a country still destabilized after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, where U.S. diplomats and intelligence personnel were operating with limited security. In the immediate aftermath, confusion over what had happened turned into a political fight. Some Obama administration officials initially described the attack as a spontaneous protest that escalated into violence.
But soon after that spontaneous protest began outside of our consulate in Benghazi, and that it spun from there into something much, much more violent.
Tied to an anti-Islam video circulating at the time. As more intelligence came in, it became clear that the assault was organized and deliberate. Republicans argued that the administration downplayed the terrorist nature of the attack to avoid political damage during an election year, and they accused Secretary of State Hillary Clinton of failing to provide adequate security beforehand and misleading the public afterward. That dispute drove years of investigations. Over the next several years, there were 10 separate inquiries and 4 major public hearings. They found serious security lapses and poor risk assessment, but no evidence that Clinton had ordered wrongdoing or intentionally lied under oath. Ironically, the biggest thing to come out of the Benghazi hearings wasn't even about Benghazi. It was the discovery that Clinton had been using a private email server. Benghazi became the rallying cry for red hats, but the email thing, that's what haunted her all the way to 2016.
Did you just waterboard yourself?
My lawyers are telling me to plead the fifth on that one.
Alright, moving on to Layer 2. Lincoln-Kennedy connections. Out of all the US presidents, 4 of them have unfortunately been the victims of assassination, and 2 of those are arguably the most historically significant presidents in American history, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. And many people have pointed out some very strange similarities between the 2 presidents, almost like they lived the same lives but 100 years apart. Both were elected to Congress in 46, both were elected presidents in 60, and both are historically known for being concerned with civil rights. Examples of this would be the Emancipation Proclamation for Lincoln and the Civil Rights Act for Kennedy. Both were shot in the head around the presence of their wives, and ironically, both of their assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, were also in turn later assassinated. All of this just 100 years apart. Almost like history eerily repeats itself. The reason why people make these connections have been narrowed down to epiphania over historical tragedies, or in layman terms, COPE. It's COPE. Patriot Act. The year was 2001, and one of the most historically significant terrorist attacks in modern history had just happened. Not only did 9/11 prompt President George W. Bush to declare war on terrorism, something we will talk more about later,
and we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
But domestically, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which included surveillance expansion, increased interagency communication, and increased penalties for crimes related to terrorism. This was highly criticized even at the time, with many people calling it an excuse to implement mass surveillance and to racially profile brown people, particularly Muslims. And we know that this criticism isn't completely unfounded. We know that the FBI was hoarding personal information of millions of Americans, and many experts highly criticized the way special entry-exit registration programs targeted predominantly Muslim countries. Now, even though much of the surveillance authorities allowed by the Patriot Act expired years ago, there's still many provisions that remain even to this day, with companies like Palantir speculated to take full advantage of this. I mean, this statement in and of itself is absolutely unhinged. Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a notorious military base located in Cuba with a long and arduous history of controversy. It is the oldest American naval base overseas and has received a lot of geopolitical scrutiny from the Cuban government since the 60s. Aside from holding notoriously dangerous criminals during the War on Terror, Guantanamo Bay is widely known for its numerous human rights violations towards its detainees during that same time period. We're talking sleep deprivation, waterboarding, extreme temperatures, etc., towards people that didn't even receive legal due process. The reason why this was justified by some in Congress is because it's outside US sovereign territory, which according to them meant that courts were not justified and constitutional protections did not apply, which was later argued to be false by a Supreme Court ruling in 2008. Thankfully. I just wish they would do something similar for ICE so I could finally travel to the country and, you know, feel safe. ERA. The ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, is a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would, in theory, prohibit discrimination between sexes. The amendment itself goes like this: equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Which sounds all well and good, so What's the problem? Why hasn't it passed already? Well, it was first introduced to Congress in 1923, shortly after women got the right to vote. You can thank these two for writing the amendment itself, Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. And yes, that is Crystal Eastman standing next to an average man in 1915. Wow, it's a lot of women. Ironically enough, it was actually Democrats who first opposed the amendment, but this has radically shifted over the years. According to Article 5 of the Constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in Congress and a ratification by 75% of states, and this came very close to being a reality in 1972, with a 2/3 majority from Congress, but unfortunately only ratified by 35 out of 38 states. The amendment has since been heavily criticized, especially during the Reagan administration, where a lot of political momentum was unfortunately lost, with Reagan himself openly opposing the amendment and conservative political activists like Phyllis Schlafly heavily criticizing it, saying things like, "Women are already privileged, not oppressed." Now that's it's a little friendly fire, don't you think? So, where is the amendment today? Well, unfortunately, it has more or less been put on the shelf. It's ratified by enough states, but Congress is divided, and I strongly doubt Mango Man is gonna do anything about it. White House Correspondent Dinner. The White House Correspondent Dinner is a celebratory dinner at the White House, where fundamental rights like freedom of speech and freedom of press is celebrated. It is a high-profile activity where the White House Correspondent Association, an independent organization of journalists, holds a high-profile dinner with both the president and the vice president. With the tradition starting out in 1921, every president has attended the dinner at least once, with the exception of Donald Trump. The intended purpose behind the dinner is to celebrate journalistic freedom and to provide insight into the relationship between the press and the president. While it is a respected tradition, the cozying up to the president has been criticized for undermining the very thing it's trying to celebrate. And over the years, the dinner has certainly shifted a lot of focus from celebrating journalism to being more comedy focused. Historically though, the dinner has highlighted a lot of significant differences from administration to administration, with some very important moments showcasing exactly that. Like John F. Kennedy refusing to attend the event unless the ban on women was lifted, or some presidents skipping the glamorous dinner entirely during stressful times like World War II. Because as you can probably imagine, holding a glamorous dinner during stressful times for the public would certainly be tasteless at the very least. Ranked choice voting. I think most of us are aware that American elections are very flawed, and this certainly won't be the last time we mention that in this video. America uses a particular voting system called first past the post, which essentially means that if you get a majority in a state, you essentially win that state, even if many voters in that state voted for the opposite party, and it's been highly criticized for undermining various democratic principles. Since America uses first past the post by electoral majority, not by popular majority, it means that you could essentially win elections without a majority of the votes. But since America has a two-party system, they can kind of get away with this. Now there's various voting systems around the world, with much fairer elections, and a popular voting system used in some of these elections is ranked choice voting. A country that uses ranked choice voting is Ireland, and the way it works is that since Ireland has a few political parties with a wide variety of candidates, you essentially rank every candidate from worst to best, which sounds a little too much like a YouTube video. The winner is then decided by comparing the rankings to each other. This is seen as highly democratic since every rank counts. Now there are some instances where ranked choice voting is used in America as well, like small local elections and whatnot. However, since America is, again, a two-party system, it would be very difficult to implement this kind of system for the presidential election, since there's really only two noteworthy candidates to begin with, and it still doesn't fix the fundamental issues like gerrymandering, campaign finance, etc., etc. Napalm. This is a notorious chemical known for its highly flammable properties, particularly the fact that if you light it on fire, it's going to burn for a very long time, and it's also going to be very hard to put out. As you can probably imagine by that description, it's historically been a very common tool for warfare, with some of the largest bombings in history like the Dresden bombings, the Hamburg bombings, and the Tokyo fire bombings all involving some type of napalm bomb. Napalm saw a lot of use in World War II, the Korean War, and of course, the most notorious use for napalm occurring throughout the Vietnam War, where napalm proved to be a very useful tool when it came to clearing out the thick jungle. But if that's not horrific enough, there's also the event that arguably solidified the tyrannic legacy of napalm, the Hanoi fire bombings and the Trang Bang incident. In 1972, America dropped roughly 20,000 tons of napalm on Hanoi, the second largest city in Vietnam, killing almost 2,000 people. And only a few months earlier, America carried out another napalm attack on a group of sheltered civilians in Trang Bang, which led to one of the most horrific war photos ever captured by photographer Nick Ut, which he later won a Pulitzer for. Me personally, I'm scared to show the photo since I don't know if YouTube will flag it. I don't think they will, but I personally don't want to take any chances, so if you're curious, just look up Terror of War, which is the name of the picture. So to say that napalm is symbolic of US tyranny would certainly be an understatement. Second Amendment original intent. As a European myself, I can personally verify that the Second Amendment, aka the right for American citizens to own guns, is frankly a very foreign concept to most of us. But historically, there's actually a pretty good reason for this particular law. After the American Revolution against Great Britain, which would eventually lead to the founding of the nation itself, some of the founding fathers were concerned that the country would eventually suffer the same fate they did as a colony of Great Britain, that being federal overreach from a strong central government. So when James Madison proposed the Second Amendment in 1789, it was done with the primary intent of keeping the government in check by giving the people guns. Now, over the years, the Second Amendment has changed quite a bit, with the modern interpretation being more about self-defense rather than opposing a tyrannical government. Now, I don't want to get political, but ice anybody the fuck? The original intent behind the Second Amendment is currently a very common talking point due to the fact that people argue ICE has become the exact thing that founding fathers like James Madison were originally afraid of, which is not a discussion we're gonna have in this video. However, ICE is a major reason why I'm personally not comfortable with currently traveling to America, and I know plenty of people that feel the same way. Unfortunately. Hanging/dimpled Chad. A hanging Chad, or dimpled Chad, refers to a small piece of paper that hasn't fully detached from the voter ballot. The reason why this is actually a very big deal is because of a past election scandal, but we'll get there. As you probably know, there are several ways you can vote in a democracy, and one of the most controversial ways to ever vote in an American election was with punch-out paper ballots in the 2000 presidential election, with Al Gore going up against George W. Bush. The way you use a punch-out paper ballot is basically by pressing holes in a paper. The problem was that the voting machines during this election failed to register a lot of these holes as actual holes, since many of these punctured holes, which were called hanging chads, were still stuck to the paper itself. This was one of the closest elections in American history, and it was particularly close in Florida, where a machine recount was required by law if the difference was less than 0.5%. Which it was, and the recount led to a narrow 500 vote margin in favor of Bush. But the hanging chad controversy would lead Al Gore to request a manual recount by hand, which was heavily opposed by George Bush. This was then brought to the Supreme Court, who allowed the recount, but unfortunately did not allow it to finish. Many people believe that if the manual recount had finished, it would have led to a different outcome, since the counties where the recount was requested were Democratic counties. There were other reasons why Gore lost, but since the punch-out ballots potentially caused a false president to be elected due to the counting issues, they would go on to be partially phased out of American politics. Something that was also very interesting with this particular election was Green Party nominee Ralph Nader, who had roughly 2% of the votes. If he would have been completely absent from the election, it would have likely led to the victory of Al Gore, since those parties share a lot of similar values. Sure makes you wonder what could have been.
Unfortunately, we'll be thinking that for most of this video. Welcome to Layer 3. At this depth, we're looking at original Electoral College, Snowden, Bush shoes, Reform Party, poll taxes, line item veto, Obama inauguration mistake, Howard Dean yelling, sovereign citizens, and death panels. Original Electoral College. In the early years of the United States, there were no running mates or unified presidential tickets. Each elector cast 2 votes for the president without distinguishing between the president and vice president. The candidate with the most votes became the president, and the runner-up automatically became the vice president. This is how political rivals John Adams and Thomas Jefferson ended up serving in the same administration after the election of 1800, despite belonging to opposing factions with radically different visions for the country. The system quickly proved unworkable, especially once political parties began to form. The problem was finally addressed by the 12th Amendment, which separated electoral votes for president and vice president, and created the basic structure we still use today. Snowden. In 2013, NSA contractor Edward Snowden leaked a massive trove of classified documents showing that the US government was secretly collecting phone metadata and sweeping up internet communications on a global scale, including data tied to millions of Americans. The disclosures revealed programs like PRISM and bulk metadata collection under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, often carried out with the cooperation of major telecom and tech companies. The government insisted the programs were legal and necessary to prevent terrorism. Critics argued that they violated the Fourth Amendment and normalized mass surveillance. Snowden was charged under the Espionage Act and fled the country. After his passport was revoked, he became stranded in Russia, where he later was granted residency and eventually citizenship. He cannot return to the United States without facing prison. Whether he's a whistleblower or a traitor depends on your politics, but the surveillance architecture he exposed didn't disappear. In fact, PRISM, the program that allows the NSA to collect emails, chats, and photos directly from major tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, was reauthorized and expanded in April 2024 to broaden the definition of which entities must provide this information to the NSA. Bush shoes. In 2008, during a press conference in Baghdad, Iraqi journalist Muntadar al-Sadi hurled both his shoes at President George W. Bush while shouting, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog." In Iraqi culture, throwing a shoe is a huge insult, and the moment instantly became global news. Bush managed to dodge both shoes, turning the incident into a strange mix of protest and viral spectacle. The image stuck because it was funny, but it also captured how deeply unpopular the Iraq War had become in the country it was meant to liberate. Reform Party. In the early 1990s, the Reform Party emerged as the most serious third-party challenge in modern American politics, built around billionaire Ross Perot and his attacks on budget deficits, NAFTA, and what he called a corrupt, unresponsive political establishment. In 1992, running as an independent, Perot won nearly 19% of the popular vote, one of the strongest third-party showings in a century. He didn't win any electoral votes, but he proved that millions of Americans were willing to step outside the two-party system. The Reform Party formally organized after that campaign, but internal power struggles, factional fights, and a lack of coherent structure caused it to fracture. One of the party's stranger footnotes is that Donald Trump briefly ran for its presidential nomination in 2000. But we'll talk about that in Layer 5. The party eventually died out, but its ideas have been warped and adapted into modern reform conservatism, the ideology behind Donald Trump's current economic policy. Editor, show those job numbers! What are those? Poll taxes. For decades, poll taxes were used across the Jim Crow South as a financial barrier to voting, requiring citizens to pay a fee before casting a ballot. On paper, the tax applied to everyone. In practice, it was designed to suppress poor black voters, along with many poor white immigrant voters, by tying a constitutional right to the ability to pay. It worked alongside literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation to maintain one-party rule without explicitly violating the 15th Amendment. Poll taxes were banned in federal elections by the 24th Amendment in 1964, but several states continued using them in state elections until the Supreme Court struck them down in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections in 1966. By then, generation of voters had already been excluded, though. Despite the legal precedent, the SAVE Act being pushed by the GOP today will largely have the same consequences if successfully passed. Those without a birth certificate that matches their ID, so most married women, those without passports, and those without a permanent address may be excluded from the upcoming elections if the SAVE Act passes. More, why do we always have to repeat history? Can't we just repeat, like, the good history? Can we bring back the time when we, like, taxed millionaires and billionaires really high? Can we bring that back? Comment? He's so not talkative today. Line item veto. For a brief moment in the 1990s, Congress handed the president the power to strike individual spending items out of a bill without vetoing the whole thing. Supporters said it would help control runaway budgets and kill unnecessary spending without impeding the passing of laws. In practice, it let the president pick winners and losers after a law had already been passed. I mean, think about it for a second. Dozens or hundreds of experts work together to write a law, it gets passed through the Senate, passed through the Congress, and signed by the president, but he decides that half the money you need isn't really necessary. Now you don't have enough money to effectively enact your law. So in 1998, the Supreme Court shut it down, ruling that Congress can't give the executive branch the power to rewrite legislation on its own. So the line item veto was gone almost as soon as it started, but that tug of war over who actually controls the money, Congress or the president, never really went away. Obama inauguration mistake. During Barack Obama's first inauguration in 2009, Chief Justice John Roberts accidentally misstated part of the presidential oath, saying that I will execute the office to the United States faithfully rather than of the United States. Obama paused, tried to follow along, and the moment became awkward on live television.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
that I will execute
Faithfully the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States faithfully.
The Constitution specifies the wording of the oath precisely, so even though most legal scholars agreed the mistake didn't invalidate the presidency, the White House did decide not to risk it. The very next day, Obama quietly retook the oath inside the White House to eliminate possible constitutional challenge. Howard Dean yelling. In the 2004 Democratic primaries, former Vermont Governor Howard Dean was riding a wave of anti-Iraq war momentum when he gave a speech that ended with an unusually loud, high-pitched shout, the now infamous Dean scream. Roll the clip.
Yeah. When she gets it,
Whoops, that was way more embarrassing. That's the right clip.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House! Yeah!
In the room, it sounded like a normal rally moment, but on television, with the crowd noise filtered out by directional microphones, it sounded a little unhinged. Cable news replayed the clip relentlessly, framing it as evidence that Dean was unstable or unserious. His poll numbers collapsed soon after. It was one weird 5-second clip, but replayed 1,000 times, and suddenly, a presidential campaign was reduced to a meme. Sovereign citizens. Everybody's seen at least one video of these freaks. Sovereign citizens are people who believe they've found a hidden legal loophole that makes them immune to US laws. They'll argue that the federal government isn't legitimate, or that there's some secret distinction between their real flesh and blood self and a separate corporate identity created by the government at birth. Based on that logic, they claim that they don't have to pay taxes, register their vehicles, or even carry a driver's license. Courts have rejected these arguments over and over again, but that hasn't stopped people from trying. You'll usually see it play out during traffic stops where someone insists they're traveling, not driving, and the police have no authority over them. It usually ends the same way. A broken window, lots of screaming, and a hard lesson that real life doesn't actually have cheat codes. Death panels. In 2009, during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin claimed the bill would create government death panels that would decide whether elderly or disabled Americans were worthy of medical care. The claim referred to a provision that would have reimbursed doctors for voluntary end-of-life counseling, but it was reframed as bureaucrats rationing who lives and who dies. Fact-checkers repeatedly debunked the accusation, and no such panels existed in the final law. Still, the phrase spread rapidly through the media and political messaging, shaping public perception of the Affordable Care Act for years. It's a perfect example of how a scary slogan can totally bury what a law actually says.
Okay, but your healthcare overall is decent, right?
Oh god, no.
Moving on. Layer 4. Ohio always votes for the winner. This is a strange coincidence that was unfortunately broken quite recently. Since 1896, Ohio has always voted for the winner in the presidential election, with 3 exceptions. The 3 exceptions being FDR, JFK, and Joe Biden. However, since Joe Biden, Ohio has gone from a swing state to a red state. All of these things highlight some very interesting things about the country as a whole. First of all, Ohio is one of the largest manufacturing hubs in the US. In fact, it has the 3rd largest manufacturing workforce behind Texas and California. But it used to be a lot bigger. Along with other manufacturing-heavy states like Michigan and Indiana, Ohio suffered severe job losses when companies started outsourcing manufacturing to countries with cheaper labor like Mexico, India, and China. Ohio is obviously not alone in this, but since their economy is so dependent on manufacturing jobs, it's causing many low-skilled workers to become dissatisfied with Democrats who they traditionally voted for, going from a swing state to a red state. state. This is a known phenomenon and is the reason why many blue-collar workers in manufacturing vote Republican today. Workers you can typically find in states like Indiana, Kentucky, and of course, Ohio. But the reason why they used to vote for the winner is believed to be the state itself being very similar to how the country used to look like. Some manufacturing, some agriculture, etc. As well as the population demographic being very similar to the US itself. If all of those reasons are true, it's gonna be very interesting seeing the state evolve in the upcoming years. Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and it allows Congress to regulate trade between other countries, other states, and Indians, but more on that later. When it comes to the ins and outs of the clause itself, it's a little complicated. Also, I'm not a lawyer, so keep that in mind. Starting with the first one. Regulating trade with other countries is clearly defined. It's up to Congress to regulate it, and that's that. There's historically not been much debate here. The exception to that would be Donald Trump currently imposing tariffs on other nations, with many people deeming that as a violation of the Commerce Clause. The reason he's able to get away with this is by utilizing a loophole where he deems them necessary for national security, which they are not. When it comes to the second part of the Commerce Clause, which would be regulating trade between other states, there's a lot more controversy. The difference between commerce inside a state versus between states can get very blurry, especially with the internet. So you can probably see why this is a very political issue, with Democrats often arguing for more federal intervention since it's technically within federal authority, and Republicans arguing for less federal intervention since it's more of a state matter. It's a classic debate on whether it's government overreach or not. When it comes to the third part of the clause, which is regulating trade between Indians, it gets very interesting because this has quite the historical significance. When the clause was written in 1787, they included this part to preserve trade relations between the European colonizers and the native tribes, specifically to keep it regulated on a federal level. The interpretation at the time was that the tribes were domestic nations, which also meant that they had their own land that was later encroached on by Georgian settlers, particularly the land of the Cherokee tribe. This led to a court case where religious missionary Samuel Worcester argued that encroaching on the land belonging to the Cherokee tribe was deeply unconstitutional. The Supreme Court went on to rule in his favor, but this ruling was later ignored by President Andrew Jackson, who would go on to order the ethnic cleansing of various Native American tribes, including the Cherokee tribe. So even though the Commerce Clause is helpful to Native Americans in many ways, there have been plenty of disputes over its interpretation, with some settlers ignoring it outright. And a lot of those problems sadly remain even to this day. Wyoming Rule. This is a proposal to increase the House of Representatives so that every state gets the appropriate amount of seats compared to the least populous state in the country, that being Wyoming. Essentially setting the state Wyoming as the standard district size and giving every state one House seat for that number of people. Or at least that's what the rule says. This would increase the number of seats in the House of Representatives from about 430 to about 570. Now, as you can probably imagine, there's a few reasons why this hasn't been implemented. First of all, you would be heavily diluting the current seats in the House, making every representative less powerful, which very few representatives want. Secondly, since there's basically no voter pressure, very few representatives feel any sort of urgency to even implement this. And thirdly, since the Wyoming rule would decrease the relative power of small states and increase the relative power of large states, it looks like the Wyoming rule would currently favor Democrats. So even if this suggestion is framed as more fair, there's a lot of people framing it as partisan, which sounds silly to me since it would not only increase the competition within both political parties, it would also be more fair towards the people, but that's just my opinion. The biggest criticism I see is the fact that the population of the smallest state can fluctuate a decent amount over time, which would theoretically make the number of seats in the House also fluctuate in an unpredictable way, but again, I'm obviously not an expert. Assange. Julian Assange is a programmer and activist primarily known for founding WikiLeaks, a website known for leaking compromising documents regarding various important companies and government entities. It was launched in 2006 as a platform for whistleblowers to upload sensitive and classified information. During the later 2000s and early 2010s, WikiLeaks were renowned for publicizing some very, very wild shit, like Iraq and Afghanistan war logs containing records of insane human rights violations in Abu Ghraib. job, which, we'll talk about that later. They were also the ones behind the Cablegate scandal, where US diplomats were instructed to collect sensitive information on UN officials, among other things. WikiLeaks, however, has received a lot of criticism for releasing information in a very blunt and insensitive way, with many names being caught in the crossfire and a very low journalistic standard. Now, despite creating a site with seemingly noble intentions, Julian Assange himself is unfortunately a big piece of shit. Allegedly. In 2010, he was accused of sexual assault in Sweden, which prompted him to move to the UK, and when Sweden then wanted him extradited from the UK due to these charges, he proceeded to move to Ecuador. So yeah, the man was guilty. Avoiding the law is probably the only reason for you to ever move to Ecuador. Assange was a hero to so many people, particularly on the left wing, and this is precisely why these charges were so shocking to people. You gotta remember, these leaks made him public enemy #1 for the US, and had they gotten their hands on him, he would have likely spent most of his life behind bars at the very least. And people respected him because of that. Never meet your heroes, I guess. Nix v. Hedden. Nix v. Hedden refers to one of the silliest court cases in US legal history. In 1883, the Mongrel Tariff Act was implemented, and with it came a row of tariffs aimed at various goods. Some of those goods included vegetables, but fruits, however, were excluded. And this is where the whole dispute started. A guy called John Nix owned a fruit company, and he was trying to sell tomatoes without getting tariffed, despite fruit being the botanical definition of a tomato. The court ended up defining tomatoes as vegetables, with the reasoning behind it being the everyday use of tomatoes is most often as a vegetable in salads and shit like that. Pretty strange court case, and it's arguably one of, if not the silliest case in the history of the Supreme Court. Bin Laden's pre-election message. Osama bin Laden and early 2000s US politics go together like butter and toast. And a great example of this is bin Laden's pre-election message. In the 2004 presidential election, George Bush was up for re-election against Democratic nominee John Kerry. And out of absolutely nowhere, a video surfaced of Osama bin Laden admitting to his crimes on 9/11. In this video, he also says that the security of Americans does not lay in the hands of Kerry nor Bush. This video was believed to have helped Bush quite extensively as it reignited the fear and worry people had during the war on terror after 9/11. Whether this was bin Laden's intention or not is unknown, but the timing was certainly not a coincidence. This, along with the Saudi prince cutting oil prices, helped solidify his victory over John Kerry. George Bush and his connection in the Middle East is something we will get back to later. This is not the first time a pre-election discovery potentially changed the outcome of that election. However, it's usually the media digging up some dirt about a potential candidate. This time it came out of absolute nowhere, and literally just days before the election. What is also very interesting about this was how some media outlets interpreted the message. Like Neil Cavuto, the news anchor for Fox News at the time, saying it was as if he wore a John Kerry campaign button, which, I don't know why I expected more from Fox News. Stagflation. Something we're seemingly getting closer and closer to. Stagflation is an economic situation where a country is faced with three major problems at once. The first being economic stagnation, where a country's economic output slows down or even halts entirely. The second problem is uncontrollable inflation. Inflation you can't really fix due to the third problem, and that is high unemployment. If you try to fix inflation by increasing rates or tightening the bond market, you end up making it tougher for companies to hire workers, which in turn makes unemployment even worse. The opposite is also true, obviously. If you try to fix unemployment by lowering rates or loosening up the bond market, you'll increase the money supply, which leads to inflation. As you can probably imagine, having both of these issues at the same time is certainly quite a challenge politically, since the economic stagnation that stems from all of this is very unpopular. And looking at the current numbers, it looks like America is heading into one of these periods, if it's not already in one. So let's talk about some of the things you can expect from stagflation. First of all, a long and arduous period of political division and unrest accompanied by lower standards of living is unfortunately going to happen. What is unclear though is how these problems eventually gets fixed. If we take a look at the stagflationary period that plagued America throughout the 70s, it was ended by an aggressive rate hike from the central bank. We're talking a whopping 20% hike that led to a 16-month recession and a double-digit unemployment rate. So things are unfortunately going to get worse before they get better. Something that also happens during stagflation is the rapid devaluing of your currency, which is already happening, but it's going to get worse. America didn't really have to worry about this as much during the last stagflationary period since there was less competition with other countries. The reason why it's bad this time around is because other economies are going to catch up to the US, which means more countries are going to seriously compete with the American standard of living, something that Europe and China are already doing. And that is usually the last straw for the dominance of prosperous nations, unfortunately. Lochner era. The Lochner era is an interesting time period in American history between 1905 and 1937, where the Supreme Court exercised great influence over the law in a way that many deemed unconstitutional. The common consensus is that it started in 1905 in New York with a banker named Joseph Lochner. Lochner argued that labor laws limiting the working hours for bakers was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Lochner, which kicked off the Lochner era, and it's very clear that the common denominator in that era was really just limiting worker rights. Another famous Lochner era case was Atkins v. Children's Hospital, which revolved around minimum wage laws for women. The Supreme Court eventually struck it down in 1923, deeming that the law interfered with the liberty of contract, which, saying that out loud, almost sounds like a parody of the judicial branch. We can't give women money. That's interfering with liberty of contract. This was, however, later overturned in 1937, in a case that would come to be known as the end of the Lochner era, West Coast Hotel Co. v. Parrish. This case determined the constitutionality of minimum wage. With FDR presenting the New Deal to combat the Great Depression, he pushed heavily for minimum wage laws. But the Supreme Court once again deemed this unconstitutional. So FDR basically threatened to increase the number of seats in the Supreme Court, which pressured Judge Owen Roberts to cast a deciding vote to maintain their independence, with people calling this decision the switch in time to save 9. The Lochner era overlapping with a large wave of progressive movements is not a coincidence, with the Supreme Court often shutting down the very laws that progressives championed for.
Nothing says democracy like a little presidential extortion, right, Adam?
Can you blame him? The Supreme Court was more rigid than my grandma's joints.
Good point, they really were. On Layer 5, we'll be looking at the Child Labor Amendment, LBJ's Jumbo, 13th Amendment loophole, black codes, the Johnson treatment, Mujahideen backing in the 80s, MMT or modern monetary theory, and Trump's 2000 campaign. The Child Labor Amendment. In 1924, Congress proposed a constitutional amendment that would have explicitly given the federal government the power to ban child labor nationwide. At the time, factories and coal mines were still openly using children for dangerous industrial jobs like mining and textile milling, and the Supreme Court kept striking down federal regulations, claiming that they were unconstitutional. So lawmakers decided to try and solve it the permanent way by amending the Constitution itself. Here's the weird part. The amendment never got the required 3/4 of states to ratify it, but Congress also forgot to put an attached expiration date on the proposal, which means technically it's still pending. A constitutional amendment from 1924 is just sitting there in legal limbo, waiting for enough states to randomly decide to approve it a century later. It's unlikely to ever move though, because child labor is now handled through the Fair Labor Standards Act, but on paper that amendment is still alive, just floating around in the legislative void. And with some states recently loosening child labor rules in certain industries, the question of federal authority over it isn't really as ancient as it sounds. LBJ's Jumbo. Lyndon B. Johnson was one of the most politically dominant presidents in modern history. He pushed through the Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act, and created Medicare and Medicaid. But he was also an absolute fucking menace in private. Johnson was notoriously proud of his penis, which he affectionately nicknamed Jumbo. According to multiple accounts from aides, cabinet members, and even Secret Service agents, he would casually expose himself in White House restrooms, during private meetings, or even mid-conversation just to shock people. Sometimes he did it to intimidate political rivals, sometimes he did it to assert physical dominance, and sometimes just because he thought it was funny. It sounds absurd, but it tells you something crucial about how Lyndon B. Johnson viewed power. For him, politics wasn't just about policy, it was physical and psychological. He didn't just persuade you, he overwhelmed you. He understood that to control the room, you had to be the most present person in the room, by any means necessary, even if that means pulling your hog out. Which brings us to his signature move, the Johnson treatment. Lyndon B. Johnson was a massive guy, about 6'3" and physically imposing, and he would use every inch of that frame to get his way. If a senator was hesitating on a vote, Johnson would walk up and get way too in their personal space. He'd grab their lapels, tower over them, and lean his face just inches from theirs. He would alternate between pleading, whispering in one ear, or flat out shouting at the other until they were so physically and psychologically uncomfortable that they'd agree to whatever he wanted just to make him stop. He knew every senator's weakness, their district's needs, and their hidden scandals. A huge chunk of the progressive 1960s legislation we have today exists simply because LBJ was willing to physically bully grown men in tailored suits until they folded. He made the process of disagreement so unpleasant that surrender was the only way out. The 13th Amendment loophole. We're all taught in grade school that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and it did. Mostly. But if you actually read the exact words of the text, it says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude ... shall exist within the United States except as punishment for crime." That one word, except, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. After the Civil War, the Southern economy was destroyed, and they had just lost their free labor force, so they found a legal workaround. They began arresting newly freed black men for incredibly minor or completely fabricated offenses, and then used that exception clause to lease them out to private companies for forced labor. This system became known as convict leasing, and it was a brutal revenue stream for states. Critics and historians argue that this exact clause led to the permanent legal groundwork for mass incarceration in America. In fact, at least 650 prisons across 46 states still use the forced labor protected by the 13th Amendment for agricultural tending and development today. So chances are that if you live in America, you've likely eaten food that is passed through enslaved hands. Black codes. Directly tied to that 13th Amendment loophole are the Black Codes. Right after emancipation, Southern states passed a series of highly specific laws designed to trap black citizens back into the criminal justice system. The most insidious of these were vagrancy laws. These laws effectively criminalized not having proof of employment. If you were a free man walking down the street and couldn't produce a piece of paper proving you were currently employed by a white landowner, you would be arrested for vagrancy. Once you were arrested and fined, you'd be unable to pay, so the state would conveniently lease you to the exact same plantation you had just been freed from to work off your debt. It was a closed-loop system. The Civil War ended, but the power structure simply shifted from one based on slavery into a system backed by criminal law, ensuring that the labor stayed cheap and the population stayed controlled. Mujahideen backing. During the Cold War, the United States was desperate to bleed the Soviet Union dry after they invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Under a highly classified CIA program called Operation Cyclone, the US began funneling billions of dollars and military-grade weapons to the Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. On paper, it worked perfectly. The Soviets took massive casualties and eventually withdrew in 1989, which was held as a massive strategic victory for the US. The problem is that you can't control what happens to billions of dollars of weaponry once the war stops. Some of the radicalized networks and fighters that the US funded and trained later fractured and evolved into groups like Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, this doesn't mean that the US directly funded Al-Qaeda as an organization, but the region was saturated with our weapons and our training, so we would be remiss to say that we played no part in their uprising. Modern monetary theory, or MMT. This one breaks people's brains a little bit. Modern monetary theory is a controversial economic framework that argues that countries like the United States, which issue their own fiat currency, can never run out of money. A fiat currency, if you don't know, is a currency backed by nothing but a government promise. Before fiat currencies, every unit of money created by the government was backed by a physical good like gold or silver. This restricted money printing as they could only produce as much money as they had in gold or silver in the vaults. We'll talk more about when the US deferred from the gold standard a bit later. Nowadays, money can be created simply because the Federal Reserve Board, which consists of just 7 members, tells the US Treasury to do so. The common myth is that the government has to find money through taxes before it can spend it, the same way you or I have to earn a paycheck before we can pay rent. But modern monetary theory argues that because the government is the one printing the money, they can always just print more money to pay their debts. Supporters of modern monetary theory argue that this means we could fund massive public programs like universal health care or infrastructure without obsessing over the deficit. The only real constraint, they argue, is inflation. This would be the in-debt-to-who crowd that insists that the US cannot go into debt because no one has the authority to make the US pay. Critics of modern monetary theory say treating the economy like an infinite money glitch is dangerously naive and risks hyperinflation akin to the German mark after World War II. You can print all the currency you want, but you can't print more steel, more oil, or more labor. If the government spends faster than the real world can keep up, prices will explode, but money will just keep getting printed. But regardless of where you stand, the fact is that the US has increased its deficit every single year this century, with the exception of the year 2000, and it hasn't seemed to slow us down yet. Trump's 2000 campaign. I told you we'd talk more about this one. Before MAGA and the Red Hats, Donald Trump ran for president in the year 2000 under the Reform Party. If you look at his platform from that run, it feels like it was written in a parallel universe. Back then, candidate Trump openly criticized Republican orthodoxy. He was pro-choice. He advocated for universal health care, and his biggest economic proposal was a massive 14.25% wealth tax on individuals worth more than $10 million in order to completely wipe out the national debt. Imagine that for a second. Really, because I don't think I can. The Reform Party eventually collapsed to infighting like we discussed earlier, and he dropped out in February of 2000, but his platform was fascinating. It's hard to imagine a pro-choice, eat-the-rich Trump, but I can't say I would be mad to see him regress back to those stances as his dementia gets worse. As we all know, 2 decades later, he re-emerged on the political scene as the face of modern conservatism. He didn't change his core values, but that's because he never had any. He used his time removed from politics to build a brand as a man of the people, and convincing the American right that he would be the man to clear the swamp, or, remove corrupt career politicians from office that didn't have the average American in mind. In practice, Donald Trump has used his time in office to provide tax cuts to the wealthiest in our country, deregulate crucial federal programs like OSHA, the FDA, and the EEOC, and just recently the EPA. Apparently we just don't have a real EPA anymore. That's insane to me. And about 1,000 more actions that I don't have time to list out right now that harm the average American worker in favor of the ultra-wealthy minority.
Lyndon B. Johnson? More like Lyndon has a big Johnson. I'm sorry.
I don't forgive you, but let's keep going.
Layer 6. Eisenhower's heart attack caused obesity epidemic. Have you ever heard about the butterfly effect? It's this theory that something small can ultimately have disastrous consequences, even if it's technically not your fault. A good example of this was Dwight D. Eisenhower suffering a heart attack in 1955. This heart attack is believed by some to be the reason why obesity is such a massive problem today, although this link is far from confirmed. Throughout the 1950s, heart attacks were a rapidly growing cause of death in several parts of the world, and no one really knew why. So when the President of the United States suffered a heart attack in 1955, this problem was brought into the limelight and became a national concern. America gathered all of their best doctors and nutritionists to try and get to the bottom of this now very widespread problem. Eventually, Dr. Ancel Keys came to the conclusion that Eisenhower ate a lot of saturated fats, which he linked to higher blood pressure, and eventually higher rates of coronary heart disease. Now, Ancel was correct about this, and he still is, obviously. But that's about where this man's brilliance ends, because he suggested a drastic change in the diet for all Americans, replacing saturated fats with refined carbohydrates and sugar. Yes. This change actually went through, and supermarkets started filling up shelves with processed junk, with many countries quickly following in America's footsteps. Something that is still a problem even today. So to say that Ancel and his colleagues fucked up big time is certainly an understatement. That being said, attributing this to Eisenhower's heart attack is a bit of a reach, since this would have been a problem with or without him. But he did seemingly speed up the process. By today's standards, Dr. Ancel Keys is not a very good doctor. His studies were often conducted with severe biases to prove his point, and in classic 1950s fashion, he very rarely studied the effects this had on women. Now you might be wondering, what was the actual reason behind the increase in heart disease? What was the actual cause behind Eisenhower's heart attack? Again, in true 1950s fashion, There was a certain habit that a lot of people had back then, and Eisenhower was no different. In fact, it's a miracle he didn't have a heart attack sooner, because Eisenhower smoked 6 packs of cigarettes a day. John Ehrlichman's confession. From slavery to Jim Crow to redlining to gerrymandering and, of course, neocolonialism, America's suppression of black people is older than the country itself. And if you weren't already convinced that many American politicians throughout history have deliberately suppressed black people, you're gonna want to hear this. In one of the scariest revelations in American politics, John Ehrlichman, the domestic affairs advisor to Richard Nixon, made a confession in 1994 about the Nixon administration's war on drugs. The war on drugs is an ongoing conflict that started under President Nixon in 1971, and John Ehrlichman's confession reveals exactly why they started it. In 1994, Ehrlichman sat down with Harper Magazine, and he was asked about the Nixon administration's war on drugs. That's when he said this. You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Just straight up admitting to the government orchestrating all of this. And it doesn't help that the man looks like a certain Batman villain. The worst part about the war on drugs is that it's still ongoing, with Ronald Reagan in the 80s escalating it even further with a 100-to-1 punishment disparity between white and black people. Black people were punished 100 times harder for doing the same crime. And even though disparity has gone down, the fact that there's still a disparity should absolutely concern you. If you need even more proof of Reagan and Nixon both being vicious racists, you should probably listen to this leaked recording.
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did, yeah, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Going back to Ehrlichman, it is very clear that they were well aware of the fact that this was all bullshit. And it still is. The reason why this conflict is still ongoing is very simple. Prisons, government agencies, etc. all rely on a lot of government funding. Funding that comes from this kind of propaganda. $1 trillion coin. This is a loophole that would theoretically increase the debt ceiling without having to go via Congress. In 2011, America reached a debt crisis when Democrats and Republicans started fighting over spending commitments. America's credit score was downgraded, and it was actually starting to look pretty bad. During all of that, a blogger known as Carlos Mucha proposed the idea of minting a $1 trillion coin. The idea was later popularized by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman in a New York Times article. This idea utilizes a legal loophole where any theoretical value could be added to a platinum coin. If you mint a platinum coin worth $1 trillion and later place it at the Federal Reserve like any other tax receipt, you would theoretically have $1 trillion to spend without having to issue any debt. However, as you can probably imagine, utilizing a legal loophole to bypass the debt ceiling without actually adding any sort of value to it could very well undermine faith in the system. Despite this, the idea was actually floated by some noteworthy politicians, but it wasn't received very well, with Obama himself dismissing the idea as more of a gimmick rather than a serious suggestion. So this really is more of a meme than anything else. It's not actually taken seriously. Senate abolition is unconstitutional. There is a lot of structural problems with the American Senate, primarily the fact that it's a wildly inaccurate representation of the people. For those of you who don't know, the Senate consists of 100 seats, with 2 senators for every state. The senators are elected with a 6-year term, and the purpose of the Senate is to represent the states, even though there are bigger and smaller states. Now, many will argue that this is by design, and that's true. However, when you compare the largest state, that being California, to the smallest state, that being Wyoming, you'll realize that the biggest state has 70 times more people than the smallest state. It's actually one of the largest Senate disparities in the world, and it's only getting bigger. So to say that the US Senate is flawed is certainly an understatement. And I haven't even mentioned the filibuster yet, which is basically an action with the intended purpose of delaying a vote. All of these problems with the Senate has made it inconceivably difficult to pass any meaningful legislation legislation since all of that has to go through the Senate. And the current day polarization of Democrats and Republicans obviously adds to that difficulty. This has led many people to actually wanting to abolish the Senate completely, or at least heavily reform it. And there's actually some countries that have already done this for the exact same reason. In June 2025, Belgium agreed to abolish the Senate by 2029. In America, though, that's going to be rather difficult for a few reasons. Firstly, America is, as you know, rather conservative, particularly the Senate. And since the Senate is mostly Republican, it's very unlikely that this change would actually go through. Like we discussed earlier with the ERA, if you were to change or add to the Constitution, you would need 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the House, and the ratification of 38 states. And in this day and age, yeah, good luck with that. But who knows? We'll see in the midterms, I guess. Lead crime hypothesis. This is a hypothesis proposing that the sharp decline in crime rates in the late 80s and 90s were due to the decline of lead used in various substances. Starting in the 1920s, lead was used in a wide variety of substances, primarily gasoline. The problem with lead, as many of you probably know, is that it's very, very poisonous. It can cause brain damage, anemia, seizures, and in worst cases, it can even result in death. All of this was widely known even at the time, but since it was cost efficient, they used it anyway. By the 1970s, 90% of children had elevated levels of lead in their blood. The devastating effects of lead poisoning is so vast we can't even fully grasp the consequences it's had on humanity. The biggest problem lead poisoning has had is arguably the neurological effects, with babies exposed to lead experiencing a reduction in IQ later in life, as well as just an underdeveloped brain. Probably why MAGA is so big today, huh? Anyway, since we know lead exposure impairs brain development, causing impulsive and erratic behavior, there's a decently established scientific consensus stating that the later reductions of lead in the air eventually caused a reduction in crime. In the late 60s, the pollution in the atmosphere was such a large problem that Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Clean Air Act, one of the most influential environmental laws ever passed in America. This, along with increased public pressure, caused a massive reduction in lead throughout the 70s and 90s, and during this time, we also saw a large reduction in crime. And again, according to the scientific consensus, this correlation is likely not a coincidence. This is still a hypothesis at the end of the day, and there's obviously other factors involved in this crime drop as well, but there's actually well-established examples of pollution affecting crime rates, and I think the Clean Air Act is something we can learn from today. We need to implement something similar when it comes to plastics and fossil fuels, especially since they cause so much damage to various ecosystems around the planet. But since those industries are so heavily lobbied, we're likely not going to see any sort of American reform here anytime soon. And this is a whole nother problem in and of itself.
So you're basically saying lead-based gasoline is why MAGA is as stupid as they are.
Well, yeah, pretty much.
That actually makes a whole lot of sense. On layer 7, we have what happened in 1971, birth of a nation, abortion caused the great crime drop, Buck v. Bell, spelling errors in the Constitution, and Lincoln's Depression. What happened in 1971? There's an entire corner of the internet completely obsessed with a specific set of economic charts that all point to 1971 being the year the American dream failed. There's actually a whole website called WTFHappenedIn1971.com compiling all these graphs that I urge you to check out, but I'll throw it over here. Before 1971, the math of the middle class actually made sense. You have two lines on the graph, worker productivity and worker compensation. And for decades after World War II, they moved in perfect unison. If workers produced more, they earned more. It was a simple, honest feedback loop. Then you hit 1971, and those lines just snap apart. Productivity keeps skyrocketing upward, but wages just completely flatline. So what happened in 1971? Well, that's the exact year President Richard Nixon executed the Nixon shock, taking the United States off the gold standard and ending the Bretton Woods monetary system. I don't really want to do another big tangent, but the Bretton Woods monetary system is worth explaining because not enough people know what we used to have. Basically, it guaranteed that the average US citizen could convert their US currency to gold for the price of $35 an ounce. Many other countries followed the system too, including the UK, Canada, France, Japan, the Soviet Union, China, and even 37 more. It was backed by both gold and the US dollar, but Nixon completely destroyed that in 1971 when he decided to turn the US dollar into a fiat currency, which we learned about earlier. The US dollar was suddenly backed by nothing but a government promise, and it had resounding effects throughout the world. And look, people can argue about the why all they want, but the charts speak for themselves. The moment we stopped using real assets and started using promises, the game changed for everyone except the people at the very top. That massive gap on the graph is the graveyard of the middle class. Productivity skyrocketed, and that wealth had to go somewhere, so it pooled in the stock market, real estates, and the pockets of people who already owned the game. While the average worker got stuck with a dollar that loses value every single year, and we're working harder than ever for it just to buy the life that was a given for our grandparents. My God, dude, I need a drink after that one. Up to this point, I was just kind of thinking, most people know all of this, right? But this one actually shocked me a little bit. Like, I wasn't at all aware that the departure from the gold standard coincided with this many problems that still plague us today. I would say that I hope we get back to some semblance of that, but I'm not stupid and that won't happen. So I guess I'll just finish this and be sad for the rest of the day. Birth of a Nation. In 1915, director D.W. Griffith released a 3-hour silent epic called The Birth of a Nation. From a purely cinematic and financial standpoint, it was groundbreaking. The first true Hollywood blockbuster, grossing over $10 million in initial ticket sales, which is roughly $200 million today. This was the silent generation's endgame. Over the next 30 years, it would earn another $100 million in then currency, which is estimated at over $1 or $2 billion today. It's one of the most prolific films of the last 125 years, but I would bet you've never seen it, and that's for good reason. The movie is 3 hours of unapologetic Ku Klux Klan propaganda, and it didn't just feature the KKK. It portrayed them as heroic knights saving the South from Black Americans who were depicted as violent subhuman caricatures, and it was wildly popular for decades. Most horrifyingly, it holds the title of being the very first film ever screened inside the White House, hosted by sitting President Woodrow Wilson, who was quoted as saying, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it's also terribly true." Like, dude, what? Brother, ugh! This is 1915, 50 years after the Civil War, 50 years after the 13th Amendment was passed to abolish slavery, and the President of the United States is calling people in stupid costumes who hunted black people for sport the true heroes of the time. I'm so glad we live in better times now. Wait, we don't? Oh, we're bringing presidential racism back. Okay. Damn it. Anyway, historians widely credit the immense cultural impact of this single movie with directly sparking the second rise of the KKK in the 1920s, leading to decades of renewed domestic terrorism. Cross burnings came back, lynchings were on the rise, and politicians openly aligned with them because it was president-approved terrorism against black and brown people, much like we're seeing today under the DHS's ICE and the scrubbing of history in the Smithsonian. It all started with a movie, not a law, not a war, a motion picture film that happened to even lack sound. If you're surprised that the silent movie and the words of a president can carry that weight, see what your conservative neighbors have to say about the murder of Renee Good or Alex Preddy. You may hear some knightly language used to describe the despicable criminals we call ICE officers. Abortion caused the great crime drop. Dude, that one feels insane to say out loud. In the 2005 best-selling book Freakonomics, economists Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner proposed several controversial theories that viewed the world through seemingly unrelated lenses. In the early 1990s, the United States was experiencing a terrifying wave of violent crime, and experts predicted it would only get worse. And then, suddenly and inexplicably, the crime rates just plummeted nationwide. Experts credited better policing or a strong economy, but Freakonomics pointed to something else: Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court legalized abortion in 1973. Levitt and Dubner argued that this allowed women, particularly those in high-crime, low-income environments, to avoid having unwanted children. Fast forward to exactly 18 to 20 years later in the early 90s, and there simply was a massive statistical absence of young men who would have grown up in the exact conditions statistically linked to violent crime. It's an incredibly uncomfortable, highly controversial theory that is still fiercely debated today, but the timing of the data makes it hard to look away from. Buck v. Bell. If you want to talk about the darkest chapters of American law, you end up at the 1927 Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court upheld a Virginia law that allowed the state to forcibly sterilize a young woman named Carrie Buck, simply because the state deemed her feeble-minded. The majority opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who ended the ruling with one of the most quotable sentences in judicial history. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. God, dude, I'm gonna start using that on Red Hat people. But, like, this is bad, guys. Seriously bad. This ruling essentially legalized eugenics in America, declaring that the state could permanently alter its own citizens' bodies in the name of genetic purity. And don't think Carrie Buck is the only person this has ever happened to. Over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under these laws, and those programs directly inspired the horrific eugenics policies of Nazi Germany just a few years later. And here's why this is down on layer 7. Buck v. Bell has never been formally overturned by the Supreme Court. It happened less than 100 years ago, I'll remind you, so it's not like it's ancient history. So according to active US law, the government can cut you open, call it science, and call it justice. Oh my God.
America! Fuck yeah!
Guys, I lied to you earlier. I did not finish my not beer, and it's time for more. Alright, where were we? Oh yeah, spelling errors in the Constitution. We tend to treat the Founding Fathers like infallible gods and the Constitution like a flawless sacred text handed down from the heavens. But if you actually look at the original document, it's full of typos. The most famous is right in the signature section, where Alexander Hamilton wrote out the state's names and spelled Pennsylvania with only one N. Throughout the document, there are totally inconsistent spellings, chaotic capitalizations, misuses of its versus it apostrophe s, and they often just use commas like wherever they wanted to, like between nouns and verbs. Like, they're minor details, but it's important because it strips away the mythos and reminds us that this document wasn't written by perfect men. It was written by tired, sweaty humans using quill pens by candlelight in a hot room in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, just trying to figure it out as they went. Alright guys, we got the last one now. We got Lincoln's Depression. Abraham Lincoln is universally remembered as the stoic savior of the Union. The reality, though, is that the man was falling apart for most of his adult life. Doctors at the time politely called his condition melancholy. Today, we call it severe borderline suicidal depression. And like, the dude had a reason to be sad. The sheer volume of tragedy he absorbed is pretty hard to comprehend. He buried his first love, Anne Rutledge, in his 20s, he buried his 3-year-old son, Eddie, in 1850, and then right in the middle of the Civil War, his 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever inside the White House. The Depression was so suffocating, I'm sure. During the winter of 1840, he hit a low point so dark that his friends literally raided his bedroom. They confiscated every knife, razor, pair of scissors, and anything else sharp they could find. I mean, look at these photographs of Lincoln taken in early 1865. His face is completely hollow. He looks like a deeply exhausted, frail, old 80-year-old man. He's 56 in these photos. That physical deterioration is the toll of a man carrying the trauma of a bleeding country on top of a brain that actively wanted him dead. Every iconic speech he gave, every military order he signed, every single morning he forced himself to put that top hat on and walk out the door was an act of agonizing, sheer endurance. The man tasked with saving the United States spent most of his adult life just trying to survive himself.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on the fact that this Trump is the same pro-choice tax-the-rich Trump from the 2000s.
I had to triple check because I couldn't believe it either. I was waiting to wake up from a lucid dream and realize I imagined the whole thing, but it seems to be true, unless I'm still dreaming.
He's still in the files, though.
Definitely still in the files, though.
Layer 8. Abu Ghraib. We talked about WikiLeaks earlier, and arguably the biggest and craziest thing they ever leaked were the extensive human rights violations American soldiers committed in Abu Ghraib. This is gruesome stuff, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail, but be warned. First of all, Abu Ghraib is a prison located around Baghdad, Iraq, and during America's War on Terror, American soldiers kept war prisoners here and put them through gruesome torture, humiliation, and sexual abuse. Some examples of this include physical torture, forcing prisoners to simulate sexual acts, and according to this very unsettling photo, dressing them up in hoods and robes while simultaneously receiving electric shocks. Yeah, gruesome shit, and it somehow gets even worse, but this is as far as I'll go. Now, I know what you're thinking. Was this just the work of some unsupervised psychopaths, or did these orders perhaps come from the top? Well, that's kind of where it gets a little scary. While they weren't explicitly ordered to torture prisoners, the lack of oversight and loose interrogation guidelines provided by the US military is at the very least a severe lack of competence. Thankfully, 11 soldiers ended up getting convicted, however none of them were senior commanders, which understandably caused a lot of controversy. So Abu Ghraib remains very much a dark spot in American history where the country took advantage of their military strength in one of the cruelest ways possible. And to no one's surprise, America got off almost scot-free. Circular number 3591. Convict leasing was a practice where corporations and other private entities hired human labor from various prisons. And as you can probably imagine, it was mostly black people. The crazy part is that this system still exists to this day, albeit to a lesser extent and with some big differences. Convict leasing became a very common practice in southern states after the American Civil War, and it goes without saying that this practice was horribly inhumane. This labor was often very brutal and deadly since there was little to no incentive to care for their health. It was basically a legal loophole that local governments used to continue slavery after the Civil War. This lasted for nearly a century, with reform happening as late as 1941, where US Attorney General Francis Biddle issued a directive called Circular number 3591. While this directive led to marginal improvements of working conditions as well as slowly shifting it to a state-controlled system, it's still a legal practice that heavily relies on the unfair incarceration of black people. This is a widely known fact, and there are so many statistics you can point to regarding this. A few examples would be the heavier policing in black communities, the higher likelihood of black people being stopped and searched by police, the higher likelihood of getting an unfair trial, and like I mentioned earlier with the war on drugs, they are more likely to get longer sentences for the same crime. All of this leads to a wildly disproportionate incarceration rate for black people, which in turn leads to black people doing more penal labor. So yeah, slavery was reformed, not abolished. Titanic purposely sunk for the Federal Reserve. This is a conspiracy theory stating that the Titanic purposely sank in order to take out the three opposers to the Federal Reserve's creation. In 1910, several powerful people secretly met at Jekyll Island on the coast outside of Georgia. Apparently, the rich elite has always had a thing for islands. The purpose of this meeting was to discuss the creation of a central bank, and the reason why this meeting was secret is because the idea of a central bank was very unpopular at the time. The three businessmen who opposed the Fed later went down with the Titanic on its maiden voyage, with John Pierpont Morgan, the founder of JP Morgan and a spearhead of the central bank narrative, canceling his trip last minute, and a year after the ship sinking, the Fed was created. There's no evidence to this being true, and there's a lot of moving parts in this theory that doesn't really make sense. However, the elites meeting on Jekyll Island did happen, and the coincidences that do exist are indeed very suspicious. It feels like the Titanic was the 20th century version of 9/11, with people creating conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory about what actually transpired. Now this happened over 100 years ago, but the concept of a rich elite discussing controversial policy and business proposals in secret is something that the Epstein files has confirmed to us is very much still a thing. Just thought I'd mention that. Lincoln exhumed. After Lincoln died in 1867, there were several attempts to rob his grave. The main incident happened in 1876, where grave robbers stole his body and held it for ransom in an attempt to free an imprisoned accomplice. The plot was eventually discovered, and after that, there were a lot of grave robbers attempting to dig up his remains, and rightfully caused a lot of paranoia surrounding grave robbers. The final reburial was in 1901, and to avoid further grave robbing, they placed him in a steel cage and buried that under 10 feet of concrete. I mean, a little overkill if you ask me, but hey, it worked I guess. Not much more to say about this, it's just kind of an obscure historical fact that people think is a conspiracy theory, but is rooted in something that actually happened. I will say though, there are conspiracy theories regarding this particular body. The most well-known theory is probably that the body wasn't actually Lincoln's body, but again, this is not confirmed and it's probably not going to. Bush bin Laden connections. Going back to what I said earlier regarding George Bush and Osama bin Laden, there's some strange connections connections between the two families. Now, before we get into the connections themselves, there's some important context you need to know. A common misconception around Osama bin Laden is that he was just some random filthy terrorist that came from nothing, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The bin Laden family was, and still is, one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia who frequently made business dealings with the US. They are tied to some very powerful people, including the Saudi royal family. So to say that Osama bin Laden had one of the most privileged upbringings you can have is not an understatement. Now, despite being privileged and well-connected, keep in mind that his family did disown him about 7 years before 9/11. The Bush family, on the other hand, is a little more well-known. George H.W. Bush was the vice president to Ronald Reagan and came from a long line of wealthy bankers and politicians. He created a massive oil empire after World War II, and his son, George W. Bush, would go on to become the 43rd president of the United States. These two families have intertwined in some strange ways over the years. George H.W. Bush, having a large oil company, made frequent business dealings with the Saudis, who were key allies both during and after the Cold War. These are surface-level business dealings, but as you can probably imagine, these connections are a breeding ground for conspiracy theories, none of which have been proven. Something that caught a lot of people's eyes was the bin Laden family's investments in the private equity firm Carlyle Group. This was criticized, but not illegal. A really suspicious story, though, is the insider trading allegations right before the elections in 2004. After the pre-election message from Osama bin Laden, there were allegedly Saudi officials who promised to lower oil prices in favor of a Bush win. How accurate that was, though, is a different story. The prices did fluctuate heavily around the election, but this was likely due to the election itself, and not some shady business deal. Most of those were severed after 9/11. Gödel's loophole. This is actually very interesting, especially considering the times we are living through. This refers to a rather complicated theory created by analytic philosopher Kurt Gödel. There's a little bit of a problem though. We don't know what the loophole is. Kurt is primarily known for applying paradoxes to mathematics. One of these paradoxes is Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. According to Gödel's theorem, no mathematical system can prove all truths using its own rules. At some point within that system, you're gonna have to just make something up. Now, we don't know how Gödel himself applied this to the Constitution, but according to his friend Oscar Morgenstern, he believed that America could theoretically be turned into a dictatorship through Article 5. Article 5 describes the legal process in which the Constitution can be changed. However, Article 5 is paradoxically also a part of the Constitution. So it's basically the question, how could you enforce a law if that law itself is part of the very thing it tries to enforce? If that makes sense. The reason why Kurt was worried about this is pretty obvious. He was born and raised in 1930s Austria. And as you probably know, there's a certain Austrian painter who turned the country he was living in into a dictatorship, and he was worried that the same thing would happen to the US. Now, I know what you're asking. Could this loophole actually be utilized? Now, from my understanding, it's not really a question if you can utilize it, because you can totally change the Constitution and Article 5. It's really a matter of, if you've changed it once, then it might get even easier to change it again in the future. To me, it sounds a little far-fetched, but then again, I'm not a lawyer. And if me and Cole have learned anything from researching this iceberg, it's that American politics is a weird mix of inconceivable ideas, cover-ups, and interpretations, coupled with heaps of controversy.
And that'll be the end of our show today, but before you leave, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Adam from the Payoff channel for reaching out to do this collaboration together. I really could not have done it alone. There's going to be a link to his channel in the description, and I hope you all click it and give him a sub. While you're down there, you might as well give me one too, it is free, and leave me a comment letting me know what you learned, what you already knew, or where I messed up. I'm sure I made a few mistakes here and there. If you like this type of video, let me know of any other icebergs you'd like to see me cover, and I hope you all have a beautiful day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.